This is Antarctica, nearly 6 million square miles of ice-covered wasteland, larger than the United States and Europe combined. Less than 1/3 of this great continent has been explored. In Antarctica, scientists hope to find the answers to many questions, which will unlock secrets of the universe.
Antarctica is more than just a whole lot of ice and snow. Antarctica is filled with interesting things, snow patterns on from the wind-blown snow. People who have grown up in northerly climes, temperate climes, think generally of snow as white. But when you are surrounded by snow and ice, and that conversion from snow to ice is a significant one visually, because when it turns to ice, it then has the capacity to pick up colors that it wouldn't otherwise. It's just an amazing array of whites and blues, all sorts of shades of blue, of greens, and again, depending upon the location of the sun, if it's a sun-setting day, you pick up the oranges and the yellows and even the reds of the setting sun as it's captured by the ice. I said, what was the most spectacular, most incredible thing that you saw while you were with us in Antarctica? And everybody said the same thing, the ice. I'm Dave Baker, and I'm here today to share with you the fulfillment of a childhood dream that started when I was 6 years old, an experience I had a long time ago, 1955, 1956, and 57, when I had the opportunity to winter over in Antarctica. One might say this is where it all started. This is basically the record of Scott's last expedition, in which he attempted to reach the South Pole and did so, but died on the way back. And the last pages of this are the letters and journal entry that he wrote to the wives of his companions who had died with him and to his friends who had supported him. His last words in his journal was, "I'm sorry, I'm afraid I cannot write any longer." My dad, who was a Unitarian minister, preached a children's sermon, and he talked about integrity, courage, and commitment. And he used as his text Scott's journal, and so it was his text that really motivated me. And in subsequent years, I started reading more about Scott, Shackleton, Amundsen, Mawson, the other great polar explorers. And little did I know, although I had a dream that someday I might go, that dream was going to become a reality. And that reality came when I got into the Navy and completed Officer Candidate School. And while I was there at Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, the Navy came out with a notice saying, "Wanted, volunteers to winter over in Antarctica." And so I put in my application to volunteer, and the rest is history. After World War II, the scientists of the world, and I truly mean the world, got together and said, we don't know much about planet Earth. And increasingly it became obvious that we're all connected somehow one to another. The forces that operate on our planet are connected in one way or another, and we need to know more. And so they proposed to their respective governments that they would have an international geophysical year. But if you're going to learn about our planet, then you have to have science stations all across the entire globe, and that includes the Antarctic. And so the different countries that could participate, not all of them could afford to put people in Antarctica, build the bases necessary to do that. But the United States, of course, is one of them. So was the Soviet Union, Norway, the United Kingdom. There were some almost 30 countries initially that were able to launch bases into the Antarctic. And one of the magic things about this was the coordination it took to do this. Every observation, for example, of the temperature, wind direction, humidity, upper air observations was done on a schedule such that that observation was done at the same time every place where there was an observation point. And so that gave us an opportunity to network all that data together and create models that today are the foundation for research and study of weather patterns and other oceanographic ocean currents on our planet. I'd just been commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy, and my next duty station was another school for officers in Jacksonville, Florida. On my way to Jacksonville, my mentor in mountaineering, who was a very important person in my life, both as a teacher when I was in high school, but also teaching me about rock climbing. He was a very, very famous American climber, had led the first K2 expedition, the American K2 expedition in 1938. He put me in touch with a guy named Bill Field, who was an official with, or officer, or a high position with the American Academy of Science. And so I met briefly with Bill Field at Bob Bates's instigation, and I explained my desire, and he picked up the phone and he called Captain Dick Black, who was the base ops officer for Operation Deepfreeze, and said, "I've got a young man here just out of Officer Candidate School who I think you might be interested in." And Captain Black said, "Send him over." So I hoisted myself across town to the old post office building, which is now Trump Tower, Trump Hotel, International Hotel. And I met with Captain Black, and he sat me down. He said, "Young man, what makes you think that you're entitled to go to Antarctica? Because you'll find as you work with people who've been there, it's sort of a clubbish atmosphere. If you've been to the Antarctic, particularly if you've wintered over, you are in a special category of people." And I said, "Well, I've done a lot of climbing. I've led my own expedition in Alaska, in the Eastern Alaska Range. I've done winter climbing in New England in the White Mountains. I climbed Mount Katahdin in northern Maine. We were the first people to reach the summit that particular year in 1949. It was 30 below zero at the summit." And as I was talking, I noticed he appeared to be scribbling something on his desk. I couldn't see what was on his desk, but when I finished, he said, "Was that all, Ensign?" And I said, "Yes, sir, that's all." And he said, "Well, let me show you something." And he handed me a piece of paper. He said, "Take a look at that." And it was a list of 17 items. And he had checked off almost all of the items on that list. And I handed it back to him because he was still talking to me, and I would have been rude to read the paper while the captain was talking to me. They taught me that at OCS. And I said, "Well, Captain, what is it that I don't have?" And he said, "Well, you're not a qualified naval parachutist." And he said, "And you're not a trained dog sled driver." And I had to agree with him that I was neither. And then I asked him, "Well, Captain, what is the duty station, my assignment, that I would be put into?" And he said, "Will you be part of a pararescue dog team?" Now, this whole idea of a pararescue team was actually Admiral Byrd's idea. And Admiral Byrd had enough clout because of his brother, Senator Byrd, that the Navy had to listen to him because the Navy depended upon the Senate to pass money, budgets for the Navy. And so Admiral Byrd was absolutely insistent that we have dogs in Antarctica. And the reason is that he did not trust things like helicopters and other aircraft. And his idea was if we lost an airplane somewhere in the interior of Antarctica, beyond the range of helicopters, that we would be jumped in with our dogs to rescue any survivors and bring them out as far as we could, where we could be reached by helicopter or by a ski-equipped aircraft, like a de Havilland Otter or a de Havilland Beaver. It was an absolutely insane idea. It really would not have worked. Now, when I told Bob Bates of my assignment, he said, "Dave, I want you to remember the basic lesson of mountain rescue, and that is that you always come out the way you went in. So if you parachute in, you've got to figure out somehow how you're going to levitate out." And I've been practicing that for quite a few years now, and I have to admit I've never been able to get over a quarter inch off the ground. So how did I get qualified? How did I satisfy those two voids in my resume? Well, in the summer of 1955, I was assigned to go to Wanalancet, New Hampshire, which is the home of the Chinook dog kennels, the same kennels that that provided dogs for Admiral Byrd in his previous to World War II expeditions. And during that summer, working with an old Antarctic hand, a master sergeant named Dutch Dolleman, who'd been with Byrd in Antarctica prior to World War II. And Dutch trained me and the other officer on our rescue team in how to handle dogs, how to care for dogs, how to run them and train them, as well as training ourselves. It was a great experience. And being a New Englander, and particularly loving New Hampshire, being in New Hampshire in the fall and summer and fall was a real treat. But then what happened about parachuting? Well, this whole idea of a para-rescue team had feet of clay, really, but the Navy was destined to push on, so they ended up sending me to Lakehurst, New Jersey to parachute riggers school. And in 1 week, I got qualified as a naval parachutist. This picture is part of the story. It shows young Ensign Baker having just completed his first parachute jump on his way to being ultimately qualified after 6 jumps. We're at Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, which is not really a jump school. It is a parachute training center for parachute riggers who learn how to repair and pack parachutes. So we had completed a couple of days of learning how to pack our own parachute, and then took one of our products of packing our own chute, and they flew us up over the drop zone, and they opened up the door and said, out you go. And so I had done exactly that. And then I made 2 more jumps that week, 2 jumps on Thursday, bad weather on Friday, held over until Monday. Monday morning made 3 jumps, and by noontime we were in their car driving back to New Hampshire to the dogs. Jack Tuck, who was my running mate on this team, on his first jump broke his leg. So as a result of that, I became the only qualified Navy parachutist and dog sled driver, I think, in the history of the United States Navy. When I told my mother in 1955 that I was going to go to Antarctica, she came up with the idea that we should have a big map, and we put pins in the map where I was and where my brother had traveled, and eventually where our children had traveled, and even now where our grandchildren have traveled. So the pins on this map represent the travels of the Baker tribe. We're going to start here at the South Boston Navy Yard, right about there, and the Edisto will take us down through the Western Atlantic, and then we will end up going through the Panama Canal, and then traveling southwest across the equator, and then on to New Zealand. And we stopped there for a few days, 3 days, before sailing again down almost due south to the Ross Sea, and then this is McMurdo Sound, and that's our ultimate destination. The distance from New Zealand, the first commercial international airport back in civilization, to McMurdo is about 2,200 miles. The distance from McMurdo to the South Pole is another 900 or so, almost short of 900 miles. So if you're going to fly aircraft into the South Pole, you would need a refueling and repositioning station between New Zealand and the South Pole, and that had to be McMurdo. The Navy has a practice of publishing a cruise book at the end of every ship that, say, goes to the Mediterranean for a deployment, or Western Pacific and so forth. And such was the case with Operation Deepfreeze. So they published this as a pictorial chronicle of participants in the expedition, and sort of essentially a historical record in photographs of the people and places and things that happened. So this is a book that has some photographs of the dogs and of me and of the kind of situation we were living in. It includes the stories of McMurdo as well as Little America, and some of the other bases. It's stories of the ships that took us there, the aircraft that supported us, and the actual operation at each of the bases. So it's a nice record of what happened and who made it happen. When I decided to go to Antarctica and my volunteership was approved, I had, for a long time, because I was a mountain climber and a rock climber, skier, I'd had a lot of experience with shooting 35 millimeter still photography. But I decided that I wanted to have a movie camera to capture this experience. This is such a unique experience that it really was going to need to have more than just still photography. So I did some research, and I found Kodak had just released a camera called the K100, a 16 millimeter camera, and I ordered one through the Navy. I don't recall how much I paid for it, I think about $400. And I ordered about 4,400 feet of film in 100-foot reels. The camera was delivered to me on the pier at the South Boston Navy Yard the day before we sailed for Antarctica on the USS Edisto. And I was opening up the box when a gentleman in civilian clothes came to see me and said, "I see you have a Kodak K100. He said, "I have, and I'm taking 3 of them with me. Let me introduce myself. My name is Elmo Jones from Disney Studios, and I will be wintering over with you." And I thought, boy, this guy's going to be a resource. And he said, "Well, let me give you 3 lessons right here. They're very easy, but it will make all the difference. The first is, just because it is a movie camera does not mean you have to move it. The second is, never shoot less than 7 seconds. The third is, if you must pan so slowly that you think your heart's going to stop." And I tried to apply those lessons in making this film, and it turned out very well. I wish I had shot more footage, but that meant I would have taken more film, and I was on a limited budget as an ensign. Over the years, I've been urged to take the movie that I made at that time and to do what we're doing today and put background to it, a narration to it, so it will be available to future generations. By late October, we were ready to go. The dogs had been trained, we had been trained, the sleds and the supporting equipment were loaded on trucks and moved from Onalancet, New Hampshire to the Boston Navy Yard. 11 dogs were to go with us on the advance party, Jack Tuck and I, and we were headed for Antarctica. On the Ross Ice Shelf, the lower corner there where the red dot is our destination. A long, long way away. 2,600 miles to the Panama Canal, an additional 7,500 miles to New Zealand, and another 2,200 miles to Antarctica. The dogs were delivered to the pier at the South Boston Navy Yard, tethered out, and you can see our ship, the USS Edisto, here. Dogs are about to have a new experience. For that matter, so are we. They had no idea what was in store for them. 11 dogs on the decks of a USS icebreaker, United States wind class icebreaker. These are the cream of the crop of our team. Jack Tuck taking a dog ashore, or aboard rather, followed by Ensign Dave Baker. Then came some of the cargo that was part of the dog team, harnesses, spare equipment, of course food to be used while we're en route. Family and friends gathered on the pier to see us off on the 30th of October, and the gangway was lifted. And this was a moment of high emotion, because as we saw that link with the shore being removed, It also was a removal of a link to civilization. We would not be seeing these people again for a year and a half, perhaps, and maybe even longer. So people waved goodbye. I'm sure their emotions were not dissimilar from ours, except they were staying home, and we were on our way to Panama as the first leg. A couple of days later, we entered into warmer waters. The dogs seemed to be enjoying the journey, and we finally reached the Atlantic side of the Panama Canal and approached the first of the locks that take you across the Isthmus of Panama. This is a new experience for me. I'd never seen anything like this before, and I was really intrigued by how easy it was to drag a ship through the locks. These small railroad engines, if you will, are called donkeys, and they're the ones that pull you through the ship. The ship does not go through on its own steam. That would be too dangerous. So they're actually pulled through by the donkey. After leaving Panama, we entered the Pacific, and as has been the custom for centuries in the navies of the world, we had a crossing of the equator ceremony. This is when the slimy pollywogs, that is, people who had never been across the equator, were initiated into the ancient order of shellbacks. And the initiating crew we see here with Davy Jones, King Neptune, the royal baby, the royal doctor, the royal barber, and we're going to see somewhat of how that works. Kissing the royal baby's belly, which is covered with axle grease, was part of the ceremony. Being prepared for surgery was another part of the ceremony. The idea is to humiliate you and end up with being dunked in a big tank, which is built not for this purpose, but actually to be used on the return of the ship to the United States months later, and it was to be used for transporting seals. It wasn't too long after the initiation ceremony that took place in mid-November before we encountered a massive storm. The Pacific is not always Pacific. In this case, we had a storm that lasted for almost 10 days with monstrous waves. We were towing a YOG, which is a harbor tanker that will be used to store aviation gasoline when we finally reach McMurdo. And so you can see what that little ship is doing in these waves, sometimes almost disappearing under the water. There was no propulsion on that ship. It was being towed by a cable, and there were 11 sailors on board who had a very rough ride for a period of about 10 days. The worst of the storm was not captured on film because you just simply couldn't be out on deck because you couldn't stand without holding on to something with both hands. As far as eating, we didn't eat very much because they couldn't cook very much. We had a lot of sandwiches and a shortage of coffee because if they filled the coffee pot too high, it would just slosh out. The maximum roll we had during that storm was 55 degrees. And I often wondered as I lay in my bunk whether or not we're going to keep on going. When you reach the edge of that degree of a roll, the ship sort of shudders. This is a bit of humor. These two men, photographers, standing on the helicopter flight deck of the Edisto, and you can see the effect of the roll here. The YOG in the background. That orange spot there is a part of the helicopter, one of the two helicopters we had with us. They were, of course, tied down very securely. After crossing the Pacific, 7,529 miles, as I count it, we entered Port Littleton in New Zealand, where we remained for a few days. I took the chance to go up into the Southern Alps to see some wildflowers and some greenery and some falling water and some alpine scenery, but nothing like we were about to see in another week or so. It was a farewell to the kind of country that I loved: mountains, waterfalls, green foliage, flowers, and it was a very meaningful experience for me to spend a day with Larry Nielsen, who is the owner of the Snowline Ski Shop in Christchurch, who helped provide us with some of the goods or services, equipment that we realized during the crossing of the Pacific that we had left behind. Once again, on the 15th of December, the gangway was lifted, connecting us to the pier at Port Littleton, and we got underway. Our 11 dogs had not been off the ship since they were put on the ship in Boston. We hadn't been able to take them ashore either in the Panama Canal or in New Zealand. It has strict restrictions on dogs entering the country. And we sailed away from the pier with a bunch of people on a Monday morning down to wave us off. As we sailed out of the harbor, one of the Navy ships that was to follow us in a few days was entering the harbor, and this is the route that we were about to follow. You can see the line from the upper left coming down to New Zealand, and we're about to take the trip along that red line to McMurdo, the continent. And we will be going to McMurdo Sound, essentially traveling almost due south to Ross Island, entering McMurdo Sound, and then the Edisto was to travel east across the foot of the Great Ross Ice Shelf to the base that was to be built at Little America 5, and then she would return to New Zealand and make that trip a number of times in the coming months. 3 days after leaving New Zealand, we saw late in the afternoon, actually during dinner, the watch announced that great tabular berg came into sight, and we hurried out on deck. I handed my camera to somebody else so they could take a picture of me with the iceberg in the distance. Bill Hardigan from NBC, there with that big camera rig, was also on deck taking pictures, as was just everybody else who had a camera, even those people who didn't have a camera. We actually sailed around this iceberg. It was quite a thrilling moment. For me, I'd never seen an iceberg before. Dick Black, task force base operations officer, the man who had recruited me, so to speak, was out on deck with us as well. The iceberg is an amazing piece of work. As you know, 7/8 of the iceberg is underneath the water, so a 200-foot or 100-foot high iceberg has got about 700 feet under. The next morning we woke up to a very different kind of ice. This is sea ice, that ice that forms every year, and we were greeted by a Weddell seal, who was the welcoming party to Antarctica. We're now approaching and have approached the Antarctic Circle, crossing over that, and now entering what is geographically known as Antarctica. The dogs were obviously very excited. They somehow sensed the journey was almost over. They became very frisky. They had survived a terrible crossing for them. During that storm that I talked about, they often have been totally immersed in water. Most of them had gained weight because the sailors had been very good about feeding them snacks. Some sailors loved dogs and fed them snacks. Some sailors were afraid of the dogs and fed them snacks to placate them. In either case, the dogs on average gained a lot of weight. As we entered McMurdo Sound, we learned something much to our dismay and discouragement, and that was that the ice in McMurdo Sound had not melted as much as we had anticipated. There was no way of knowing this in advance, but we were actually 44 miles from where we intended to go. That meant 45 miles of over sea ice travel. The Glacier, USS Glacier, the Navy's biggest icebreaker at the time, had preceded us by 1 day and dropped that de Havilland Otter aircraft on the ice, and so she was there ahead of us along with some other equipment. The challenge now was to go from the edge of the ice, the 44 miles south across the sea ice to Hut Point, a trip that was to take us 3 days. The ice here is about 6 feet thick, But as you go further south and get into ice that's older, that ice will be as thick as 16 feet by the time we finished our journey. This is 2 o'clock in the morning, so you can get an idea of the effect of the, quote, midnight sun, unquote. The dogs are now taken off the ship and being put into harness. Turk, the lead dog, goes first, and his job is to keep the gang line there taut as the other dogs are placed in harness. And it was not too soon thereafter, like 2:30 in the morning, that we headed south, leaving the Edisto. Again, a very sentimental moment, because we were truly part now of a very special operation. Happy sled dogs show their tails in the air. We're pulling 2 sleds, one after the other, with a bicycle odometer attached to the final sled. That measures the distance traveled each day and is one of your primary navigational tools. It wasn't long that we passed a weasel, a broken down weasel that had some problem with its engine, and we took a great deal of satisfaction that the travel mode of yesterday was surpassing the travel mode of today. In the background of the lower slopes of Mount Erebus, this 12,000 plus semi-active volcano, the most southerly volcano on the planet, southerly active volcano. And here again, the scenery you see is absolutely mind-blowing. Mount Erebus is a truly spectacular mountain. Little puffs of smoke coming out of the summit. We're happy and the dogs are happy. And that first day we were to make 17 miles across the ice, a remarkable feat considering the fact that the dogs had not been exercised for almost 2 months. Not all of the ice is smooth. As a result of storms during the winter, the ice tends to raft up on itself and creates this kind of terrain, which is a little more, slows us down. It wasn't long before 2 Adelie penguins from the rookery at Cape Royds, which is a few miles to our east, appeared as a welcoming party. They're preening because they want to look their best for the camera. And so what a wonderful shot this is, a very unusual shot. Not many of these exist, with Erebus in the background, dogs in the sled in the foreground, and penguins in the foreground. This was an amazing and memorable time, and it's one of my favorite scenes in this entire movie, and I hope you enjoy it, because it is very special. The dogs resting, we're resting, the dogs watching the penguins, and the penguins watching the dogs. After 17 miles, we made camp. The dogs were tired, and so were we. We hadn't been getting much exercise during the transit from Boston to the ice either. This penguin came in. I don't think it was part of the other 2, but he came in to welcome us, and the penguin had never seen dogs, and obviously the dogs had never seen penguins. The penguin strutted up and down the line of dogs and picked out Ko. Ko, of all of our 11 dogs, is the biggest fighter. He was the bravest. He was always the first out front and causing ruckus. You can tell by these pictures that the penguin got the better of that argument. Shortly thereafter, one of the helicopters from the Edisto dropped in to see how we were doing, and I took the opportunity to get on the helicopter and scout out the terrain ahead. We knew it was going to be a little rougher than the terrain we'd already been through. We also knew, because we'd heard reports, there was some open water, open leads, and we wanted to avoid those if possible. So I'm in the helicopter, fortunately strapped in because I almost fell out. Back on solid ice, we're getting ready to break camp. It's a warm day, probably in the high 20s, no wind, the sun beating down on us, and it's possible even to strip down to your shorts and not be too cold. The humidity is so low in Antarctica that you don't feel the cold, particularly if there's no wind. Here's one of our companions lacing up their felt boots. These are boots of choice in polar travel, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. The next 2 days were really tough going, and I didn't take any pictures because we spent so much time pushing the sleds, helping the dogs, we didn't have a chance to do that. But we did arrive on the 23rd of December at Hut Point. Number of sled loads that had preceded us, a lot of tents had been erected already, This is a very historic spot because it is the site of Scott's first cabin from his 1901-1904 expedition. A lot of cargo been brought in already. Our rescue tents with the orange ridge across the top have been set up. Tom McAvoy, who had gone with us as one of our dog sled drivers, is checking the dog food supply. Jack Tuck is also checking the offloading process. And you can see we've already moved a fair amount of equipment just using the Weasel, that tracked vehicle that you saw in an earlier picture. The cabin at Hut Point is in these pictures, and you'll see that in just a minute. This is not a crevasse, it's a tidal crack. A tidal crack is formed when the ice of the land abuts the ice of the sea ice. And as the tide goes up and down, the sea ice, of course, goes up and down with it and creates that crack. I had, quote, borrowed this sign from a national forest in New Hampshire and brought it along to add a little humor. There's the Weasel. The preferred way of riding in the Weasel was up on top because the inside is pretty cramped in the back seat. The dogs are just delighted to be in the snow. One of the things that is interesting is that from the moment we reached the snow, they never had to drink water. They instinctively knew that their source of hydration would be the snow. Here they are tethered out. Their pads were pretty well tenderized by the trip in, the 44-mile over sea ice. And so we just needed to give them a break. So we tethered them out just on the little ice there on the bay there at Hut Point. This picture shows very clearly Scott's hut, fully filled with snow. So all the time we were there, that snow was filled the cabin. And it wasn't until later the Antarctic Heritage Trust came in and removed all the snow, thawed it out, and has restored the cabin to the condition that it was in Scott's days. Dogs in the background, tents in the foreground, and here, as a result of bulldozing up a snow wall to protect the dogs from the ever-present wind that blows in McMurdo Sound. Most of the dogs appreciated that shelter, but some dogs saw it as a challenge and spent all their time digging it down, removing the snow. In the background, one of the helicopters, which was a very important part of our first days in McMurdo. Coming into the background there is the tail of a P-2V aircraft, which had come in from New Zealand, ski-equipped aircraft, and landed on the sea ice. Once again, the dogs eating snow and just enjoying themselves. We were feeding them actually food that we brought with us from the United States at that point. Later on, we would be feeding them a more polar diet of pemmican and seal meat and seal blubber. The dog's coat began to fill up right away. At one point, we took the opportunity to climb Observation Hill, which is behind our encampment, looking out at Mount Erebus and panning slowly to the east, ultimately looking out over the Great Ross Ice Shelf towards Little America, some 450 miles to the east, our nearest neighbors. In the lower foreground is part of the Great Ross Ice Shelf being held back here by part of Ross Island. At the end of that, if you were to go to where it's flat, you would find the ocean. From Observation Hill, looking down, you can see our tent camp, the dog penned out over on the left, Scott's hut essentially in the center, and our tent camp arranged around it. This picture is a picture taken from Observation Hill, and if you look very carefully in the center right, an airplane is flying across the lower slopes of Mount Erebus. The idea here is to give you a scale. The scale of Antarctica is just amazing. It's mind-blowing. And the interesting thing is that you don't really appreciate it because there's nothing to compare it with. There's no buildings, there's no trees, there are no plants. And so that's a 12,000 plus foot mountain. That's an airplane. And you really have no sense of scale because of the fact that there's nothing common to compare it with. As mentioned before, Erebus is a semi-active volcano, sometimes more active than other times. And here we're flying over it, looking down into the crater And actually, people who have climbed Mount Erebus, scientists to study the volcanology of the mountain, have taken pictures of molten lava in the caldera. I have to admit that some of this imagery is not mine, and this is official Navy photography. Here is a picture of the effect of the wind on the ice, but another more important is the cross in memory of Captain Scott and his party, who perished on their return unsuccessful attempt to reach the South Pole ahead of the Norwegian Roald Amundsen. So we have here the names of the men who died, Scott himself, Wilson, Owers, Bowers, and Evans. All of them perished after they had reached the South Pole and were returning to McMurdo. There's a line on this cross, which was erected the year following their death, who died on their return from the pole, March 19th, 12th, with a line from Tennyson: to strive, to seek, and not to yield. We climbed that mountain many times, and every time I saw that cross, I was greatly moved. Back down in our campsite, again, the helicopter turning up with the P-2V aircraft in the right there, and we're going to use this helicopter to take a trip out to the icebreakers. Flying out, we're looking back at our encampment at Hut Point, flying close over the sea ice. You can see the shadow and the rotors turning. While we had been working in the camp, building the campsite, the glacier had been busy trying to break the ice and create a channel from the original edge of the ice into the base. This was absolutely essential if we were to complete the construction of McMurdo. And if we hadn't been able to complete the construction of McMurdo, there would have been no South Pole, because McMurdo was the McMurdo base, which later became the McMurdo Air Facility, was critical to the successful construction of the South Pole. So this gives you a very good idea of how an icebreaker breaks ice. There are ice cutters that operate in the Great Lakes, and they really do cut through the ice. But these icebreakers, especially reinforced hull with enormous engines, diesel engines, they actually plunge into the ice, maybe a half or even 3/4 of a ship length at a time, and the very weight of the ship crushes the ice beneath it, creating the channel. So 24 hours a day, the ship charges ahead, and each charge results in another 20 or 30 or 50 or maybe even 100 feet of ice broken out, with the hope that the wind coming out of the south will blow the broken up ice out the channel and keep that channel open. That's critical to the operation. So you can see here, there she is. And finally, after a period of time from the 20th of December to mid-March, the glacier broke its way at the very most through 16 feet of ice into Hut Point. The first ship to be there since Scott's ship in 1901. This was a great celebration because there were times we thought it would never happen. It was essential because we needed to tow the 2 YOGs that were going to be used to store aviation gas into McMurdo as the refueling source for aviation gas for the coming air operations. The ship actually was able to carve out a little turning basin there because the water here is very shallow and the ice had eroded from the underside, and so it was much thinner than the ice that had been breaking through just a few hundred yards away. This is a little cross to Seaman Vince, who died, was a part of Scott's party earlier. The ship stayed with us for a couple of days, and then finally, in late March, it left for Norfolk, Virginia. Watching the ship leave us, I was standing with Ike Taylor, our doctor, watching this happen. Scott's cabin there in the foreground, and the glacier steaming north. And it was like standing on the street corner at midnight, having sort of stayed in the bar too long, and watching the last bus out of town leaving. Except in this case, there was not going to be a bus the next day. It was going to be the following October before we would have contact with the outside world again, except by radio. So it was a very powerful moment, because all sorts of things ran through your head about this departure. I mean, the lifting of the gangways had been emotional moments, but that was even more so. With the departure of the glacier, shortly thereafter, the sun departed. And even though the sun had set on us for the last time, because of the high mountains across McMurdo Sound, they continued to capture the sunlight for a few more days. Now the winter night has set in, and it's time to do the work that would be required to prepare for the following spring. This is the communications center. Radio Marino here operating his speed key. He was one of the best radiomen and known throughout the Navy for being a speed key operator, sending messages and receiving messages from the rest of the world. Bob Pittman operating on an old Underwood typewriter, I think. The radio equipment we had was actually all surplus from World War II, and quite frankly was not up to the task. The conditions of upper atmospheric conditions are really limiting in the kind of communications that you have. We had a huge antenna aimed at the canal zone, and that enabled us to have some communications on a daily basis. We had a spiritual life. We had built a chapel. We called it the Chapel of the Snow. We had a Catholic chaplain, John Condit, who gave both Protestant and Catholic services. It was interesting. He worked very hard to convert the sailors to Catholicism, and every time he did, he sent a message back to the Chief of Navy Chaplains about his accomplishment. Eventually, we got a message back saying cease and desist, because the Chief of Navy Chaplains, being a Protestant, felt that John Condit was taking advantage of the isolation. Elmo Jones, the Disney photographer here in the chapel, recording choir practice. We also had entertainment. John Condit was the director, producer of these periodic Saturday night entertainments. We didn't have them every Saturday night, but this is a night, N-I-G-H-T, not K-N-I-G-H-T, a night in King Arthur's court. And it's complete with costumes to celebrate the knights there. These are the knights in their white domed hats, plumed hats. And this is, of course, recognized as the Virginia Reel, with Queen Guinevere and King Arthur in the background, sitting on the mess hall serving table. John did a great job putting these on. He played the he played the accordion, the guitar, the banjo, the harmonica, and the pump organ. And so he was able to entertain us. Finally, the sun came back, and Howie Westbacker here, who is the representative from the National Science Foundation who wintered with us, is painting the South Pole. Little known fact, that South Pole is a piece of bamboo that we picked up in our passage through the Panama Canal and brought with us. And to my knowledge, the South Pole that you see in modern pictures today is that very same piece of bamboo. Among other things that we did now that the sun has returned is we have made a trip to Cape Evans, and this is Scott's cabin at Cape Evans for his later expedition, the expedition which he took to the South Pole and from which he never returned. There's a story that goes with this trip, which is going to be in the epilogue. We're looking at the sea ice in the background with a big glacial tongue sticking out, that white bar at the very far left, just by the roof line of the hut. This hut was used by both Scott's party and also Shackleton's support party several years after Scott's remaining men had abandoned it. It, unlike Hut Point Hut, was not filled with snow. At Cape Royds, where the cabin that was built by Shackleton is located, there is a rookery, a Adelie penguin rookery, and these shots are taken there at that rookery. It's quite a small rookery compared to ones on the Antarctic Peninsula, perhaps 250 or so nesting pair here. And when you go to see some of the rookeries on the Antarctic Peninsula side, several of the rookeries have over 1 million birds in them. You can see the nests here, the stone rocky nests. That's the only source of building material that penguins have to protect their eggs. They generally lay 2 eggs, and of the 2, usually only one of the 2 penguins survive. There's a constant bickering in these rookeries as the penguins protect their domain, their territory, and one way that penguins build their nest is to rob the pebbles from their neighbors. So there's a constant movement of building material throughout the rookery. People say, how do you get water? Water is critical. The dogs handle it very well, they eat snow. But we needed to get water and melt the snow, and that is a pettibone carry lift bringing the snow into this big snow melter, which is a big, huge box that has pipes running through it, through which a warm fluid goes, and that's how water is made. One of the jobs I had was to train the advance party who would be going to build the South Pole Station in the coming months, train them in winter survival. You say, well, after spending the winter there, wouldn't they already be pretty well trained? Well, it's one thing to work every day in cold conditions up to 77 below zero. It's another thing to work all day and then retreat to an unheated tent and sleep in a sleeping bag when the temperature outside is in the 40 below zero range. And so my job was to orient the men and to give them the skills and knowledge to handle that kind of situation. Fortunately, it was not going to last for very long, but even one night, if you're unprepared in those conditions, is pretty tough. As my camera was running, it was freezing up, and the slower a camera runs, the faster the action. So here we see an unrealistic fast movement of the sailors as they take the stuff off their sleds and stuff it in the tent. The next morning, I borrowed a heating pad, a chemical activated heating pad from our hospital corpsman who was on this particular trip. I ran these every night for a couple of weeks, and I put it next to my camera, and it heated the camera up to the point where I got a more natural rendition of the movement of the men pulling their sleds. These sleds had sleeping bags on them, food, fuel, stoves, and a change of clothing. Having completed the night on the ice, these men were far better qualified to survive. It wasn't all work. There was play. There's a large snow slope above our encampment, above the base, and we took the opportunity to practice our skiing skills. This is your host skiing, and this is your host falling down. I'm a much better skier now than I was in 1956. This ski slope no longer exists because it's all melted. Part of the springtime ritual is to clean up your beard, and here is Chief Stith. We saw him earlier in the chapel scene with a very, very big, very bushy beard, and here is one of our steel workers, Dewey Kemp, removing the beard. He doubled duty as a steel worker and also as the camp barber. This is an automatic weather recording station, and you'll see in a moment an antenna pop up. In this case, the top of the antenna came off and fell down, but these were an experimental device designed to be dropped by parachute in remote parts of Antarctica that could record temperature, humidity, and wind velocity and send that back by radio transmission to our base. It was an experiment, and it didn't work very well. In contrast to that, this is a kind of different kind of equipment here. This is one of our welders working on the track of a D2 Caterpillar tractor, which was one of our primary movers at the base. So we had the very complicated scientific equipment, and we had the very heavy-duty transport equipment, and we needed to maintain and operate at both levels. We needed the men who had the skills to do that and the ability to be creative in how they did that. Operation Deepfreeze 2 was about to get underway, and that involved the first thing, the arrival of aircraft from New Zealand. Before we get to the landing of the aircraft, we need to put some radar, ground control approach radar in position. So that equipment was being towed out to the runway, and shortly thereafter the first plane arrived from Christchurch, New Zealand, 2,200 miles across the open water, with nothing but open water and ice in between. This was an R-5D, a 4-engined, wheel-equipped airplane that circled over our base, gave it one circle pass before it lined up to land on the runway, the first airplane to land on our new runway, built during the middle of the winter, built under very difficult conditions, and here we see on final approach about to touch down. Our runway was 6,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, and you can see the approach to the runway just coming into view. One of the problems was depth perception, and later on the Air Force had quite a bit of problems with that because they landed 3 of their Globemaster 124s short of the runway, collapsing the nose gear before it skidded along the runway. We solved that problem by planting some Oregon Douglas fir trees, Christmas trees, flown in from Oregon to create some sense of depth perception for the pilots landing their aircraft. So here we are, very exciting, another one of those very memorable days that sticks in my mind. Shortly thereafter, 2 other aircraft landed, came in arriving from New Zealand. These are ski-equipped aircraft. They're the R-4D and the aircraft that we had seen the previous year and would become the backbone of much of our operation. The fact they are ski-equipped made them much more able to go to areas that the wheel-equipped aircraft could only go to drop their cargo. They couldn't land. The 2 aircraft had been separated on their way from New Zealand to Antarctica, and the second aircraft actually ran out of fuel as it was landing. They were followed by the first Air Force Globemaster, flown out of Donaldson Air Force Base in South Carolina. These huge aircraft would be to the cargo delivery aircraft that would be responsible for moving literally tons of fuel, food, and supplies to the South Pole. This one is not landing short, as you can see. As a matter of fact, he took plenty of time and landed about 1/3 of the way down the runway. Looking from up on the base out there, I wondered maybe he might have overshot the runway. You can see the other Navy aircraft that had preceded him there on the, if you will, on the tarmac, on the ice beside the runway. We're looking essentially south and west here. As I mentioned before, this runway is about 16 feet thick ice, multi-year ice, and you can get a sense of the scale here of the planes with the R-4Ds in the background and the C-124 in the foreground. We also had a P-2V that had a tragic accident that had landed in this same time frame. The pilot, never having landed on ice before, asked permission to circle the runway, make one pass, and then come in for the final approach. Unfortunately, they misjudged how far they were off the ice, and as he circled back to come and line himself up for the final approach to the runway, his wingtip, his right wingtip, caught in the snow, and the plane catapulted across the ice, killing 4 of the 8 men aboard. It was a major, as you can imagine, setback for us and cast a sense of gloom and despair over the entire camp. These planes, on the brighter side, had brought in the first mail that we had been able to receive since the previous February. A welcome relief. It also brought in the first fresh vegetables and fresh fruit. Again, to get the idea of the scale of these aircraft, this is a Tucker Snowcat being offloaded. Tucker Snowcats are made in Medford, Oregon. So not long after that, the admiral decided it was time to go to the South Pole. A photo op and reconnaissance. And here you see the JATO smoke left over from the takeoff as the plane flew into the South Pole. Again, we repeated the operation from the previous year. The ice is not as thick this year, and this is one of the Coast Guard icebreakers breaking its way into Hut Point. The same challenge existed, and that is to be able to bring the resupply cargo ships in as close to McMurdo as possible to limit the length of the journey from the time that the ships were able to offload onto the ice to when the material was able to be delivered to Hut Point itself. Of course, the demands were not as large in terms of the amount of cargo to be moved. Once again, you see the way that icebreakers work on breaking up the ice. The wind class icebreakers, both Navy and Coast Guard, are much smaller, but they still have incredible ice breaking capability. Once again, a sign of the coming of summer. This is a Weddell seal pup with its mother watching over it. Sad to say, for the purpose of keeping our dogs healthy and fed, seals became one of the sources of food. And I found it very, very hard personally to kill a seal and butcher it for dog food. But it was a necessity. That would not happen today, of course, since there are no dogs. Well, the decision was made after monitoring the temperature of the South Pole by almost daily overflights that the temperature had risen to the point at the South Pole that men could be taken in and put to work starting to build the South Pole Station. So in very late October, the decision was made to launch the dog teams. The dog teams were taken as a backup plan because they were going to drop a weasel in when they flew in and dropped the advance party. The weasel would be dropped from the C-124, but if something happened in that parachute drop, they would need the dogs to take them from where they landed to where the actual South Pole was, because there was no way of knowing. There's no flag there. There's no South Pole. It's not marked in any way. The last people who had been there was, of course, the Admiral a few weeks before, and they'd marked it, but there was no guarantee that they would find that marker when they returned. So if something happened to the weasel, they might have to make an over-snow trek from where they landed to where the actual South Pole was. And that turned out to be the case. The engine block on the weasel was cracked on landing by parachute, and so the dogs became essential. When they landed, they were able to take shots of the sun and determined that, in fact, where they had landed was 17 miles from the actual South Pole. And so they used the dogs to move that advance party that short distance. That party was led by Lieutenant Dick Bowers, who was our construction engineering officer who oversaw all construction at McMurdo and the South Pole. Remarkable Yale graduate who became a lifetime friend of mine until his death about a year ago. So the dogs are on their way out to the runway with Jack Tuck, the other dog sled driver, leaving K.O. behind. K.O. that morning, it turned out, had some kind of urinary infection and had not been able to go with us. And you can see he's quite perhaps happy that he didn't go. I don't know. The plane that would be taking them, one of the two planes that would be taking them, would be Case Sarah, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Gus Sheehan. The other aircraft was named the Charlene. Here is one of the C-124s that had that early abrupt nose-tail landing. And here is the C-124, one of the C-124s that I just mentioned a moment ago. Interesting juxtaposition between the two aircraft. wheeled aircraft in the background, ski-equipped aircraft in the foreground. Although, of course, the ski-equipped aircraft could also land on its wheels, so it was had both capabilities. Loading the dogs aboard the plane for their first airplane trip. Another first. I had somewhat bittersweet feelings about this because I would have loved to have gone with him, but my commanding officer said I was needed back at the base as the communications officer, overseeing the communications, all communications on the ground, as well as communications with the rest of the world, particularly communications with New Zealand. Plane taxiing out, getting ready to go. People with cameras, observers, Mount Erebus in the background as she taxis out onto the runway. Second aircraft coming out, Que sera, sera. So the dogs were split up between the two planes. The sleds were on the planes, the gear was on the planes, and the advance party was ready to go, and here they are taking off. These aircraft were overloaded. As a matter of fact, they were so overloaded that the authorities, the bureaucrats in Washington, had quite a hissy fit when they found out the gross loading of the planes on their way to the pole. But we really had no alternative. It's over a 900-mile flight, and you got to go and you got to come back, and you got to have the spare fuel. So now we're moving ahead, and my camera caught a ride on a flight to the South Pole, and I just want to show you a little bit about what the interior of the continent looks like. Much of the mountainous area of Antarctica is not visible because it's under thousands and thousands of feet of ice and snow. But some of the mountains are high enough to poke up through the great polar ice sheets that surround the South Pole. The Antarctic is home to 90% of the world's fresh water captured in the ice. And almost all of the Antarctic continent is covered in snow. Very little of the continent has exposed rock, as you see here. So we are flying over the Transantarctic Range, which is truly runs across the entire continent, and we're now at the South Pole. We're at 9,285 feet. That is not the highest point in Antarctica. 16,000 feet is the highest point. And you can see that the scenery at the South Pole is not exactly exciting. In the time since that first advance party got there and the arrival of this flight, quite a bit has been done. You can see the buildings have been erected. The Raywin Dome is there, that sort of golf ball-like shape there on the top of one building. That's an observation station for observing upper atmosphere balloon launches. That's a D2 Caterpillar tractor that actually the second one that was dropped, the first one, the parachute failed and the tractor buried itself in about 16 feet of snow. But it was used, as well as the Weasel, to prepare the site for the building. If you look very carefully on this plane, you can see the JATO bottles suspended underneath the aircraft. So it's a very arduous task, a sled load at a time. These aircraft could not carry an enormous amount of cargo with them because of the necessity to carry a fair amount of fuel. This shot here is the pole a year later. It is not one of mine, but I took it out of the archives of the Navy, and I just wanted to show it as part of the South Pole development, because it shows what had happened in the year since the original shots that we looked at earlier a moment ago have been taken. So the antennas are still there, the Raywin Dome is still in evidence, but you can see there's been a lot of snow. Now that snow is not snow that is fallen snow, it's snow that is blown, because the Antarctic is really a desert, and the annual snowfall at the pole is about 4 inches a year. But with the constant blowing of the wind, anything that interrupts the flow of that wind-blown snow will cause snow drifting. And as the drifting snow builds up, it tends to build on itself. So within a year, the buildings were covered. Remote bases always have a sign telling you how far the rest of the world is. And this is the one at the South Pole. Names the cities and the distance. And now we're returning back to McMurdo. Once again, looking at these extraordinary mountains, so many of them still visible, but so many others buried under the ice. Fuel is a very important resource in Antarctica. Not all of it comes on a tanker. Not all of it comes from the ships. Much of it, in this case, 10,000 55-gallon drums had to be manually offloaded and stored. And here we have an operation that ran for a couple of weeks, 24/7, 2 shifts of 12 hours each. And these sailors moving these drums, very, very heavy drums, off the sleds and into our fuel depot. It's amazing, given the weight and the bulk of these tanks, that we had only one accident where a man got his hand pinched. This is a shot that you will never ever see again. Chief Stith, who was our chief storekeeper, had picked up a Adelie penguin yearling, and this is absolutely prohibited. And in this case, that is prohibited as well. So the only people that can handle any kind of Antarctic wildlife now are the qualified, certified penguin specialists or seal specialists or other people who have the skills and knowledge. It's very important that this Antarctica continue to be a great science lab. Out at the edge of the ice, I'm going to go on this Bell helicopter. These helicopters didn't carry cargo, but they were sort of the Uber of those days, and it was a great way to get from one ship to another. That fellow there is walking, carrying some movie canisters, films from one ship to another to share with the sailors. But the problem of going from one ship to another here moored next to the ice, you can see oftentimes the ice around the ship is pretty well broken up. And you can often, in some cases, leave one ship and heading for another ship. And by the time you got there, the ice had broken up around that ship. So you had to walk back to the ship from which you had started, and you came back to that ship, and the ice there had broken up. So it was a constantly moving situation. Back at camp, we're taking a look at what's happened in the months since the return of the sun. The buildings are now pretty much complete, and we're getting ready to transition from being hut point residents to returning to civilization. The big oil tank or fuel tank that we built, and one of the YOGs coming into view there. The second one is about to show up there. And these YOGs served their purpose. However, the following year, a terrible storm came in and blew the 2 small ships away from their moorings, dragged them out, and they were never seen again. We don't know what happened to them. They're somewhere in the bottom of the sea somewhere. This is the John Toll, Private John Toll. It's a Navy transport ship, and it is the ship which was to carry me back to civilization a little bit later. It's in the process of being offloaded, and among the gear that was being taken off this ship was the building material for the New Zealand base, which was to be built just about where my survival training camp was. In the distance there is the USS Curtis, a seaplane tender, very unlikely ship to send to the polar regions, but it was used as a transport vessel for the scientists who would be part of the IGY, who would be manning McMurdo and manning the South Pole base. So it was actually the luxury cruiser, simply because it accommodations for senior staff in the Navy as a seaplane tender. Another way of transport from ship to ship was these landing craft personnel carriers, and so they supplemented the Bell helicopter, and of course they could carry a lot more. They could carry cargo and many more people than the Bell. The Bell could carry the pilot and 1 passenger. Here you see one being used to carry quite a few people. The fellow in the black hat there is a Russian. Some Navy people, a lot of scientists. Again, looking out over the sea ice with the Curtis there coming into view on the right. This is the only picture that I know of ever taken of the Curtis moored next to the ice, because the winds blew so fiercely that every time they had her moored, the freeboard, in other words, the vertical surface of the ship, was a big enough surface that the wind blew hard enough, and it kept pulling the dead men out of the ice. And so for just a few short hours, the ship was actually moored next to the ice. And I managed to capture a bit of film coverage of that. Two of the icebreakers nested together, same class, wind class icebreakers, the Coast Guard on the outboard side and the Navy icebreaker on the inboard. Ice here, the sea ice here, probably 3 feet thick. The local bus service carrying the scientists from the ship side, we saw them before, into the base. These methods of transport have been replaced by very large buses now that actually operate on big wheels. Back at McMurdo, a couple of shots of Mount Erebus once again, with the smoke this day coming out. And now it's time to go. I went aboard the Toll in late January, and for a couple of days I remained on the Toll because she was finishing off loading. One morning I went in for breakfast, and the ice around us to the south was pretty solid, and I had 45 minutes of breakfast. When I came out, this is the scene that I saw. In that 45-minute period, about 400 square miles of sea ice had gone out to sea, literally broken up. And where this had been solid sea ice minutes or hours before, is now open water with killer whales, orcas, having come in. And what they're looking for are seals and penguins. And in some cases, you could actually see the dorsal fin of the orcas moving through the leads, the open leads of the sea ice as the ice breaks up. Orcas have been actually known to push themselves up underneath an ice floe to tip it over to dump one of these critters, one of these penguins, in for dinner. As we left McMurdo, the Adelie penguins came out to bid us farewell. It's a memory that I will carry with me forever. They're curious birds, they're funny birds, they're social birds. They're really a delight to spend time with. One can sit and observe them forever. And they are great swimmers. Last one in's a jerk. And it never fails to amaze me as to how they survive the conditions of Antarctica. There are many different species of penguins, and there are only a few that are Antarctic penguins, the northernmost being the Galapagos penguin, living on the equator. I'm looking back now at Hut Point from the vantage point of the Toll, and as we leave my home for the previous year and a few months. It was, again, one of those emotional times because it was, in a way, hard to leave. It had been an amazing experience, but it had been home. And to see it under these conditions so changed. That's the ice that we used to travel across with the dogs, on the weasels, fly over in the helicopter. And now, look at it. Miles and miles and miles of open water. The timing was perfect because the offload had been completed and we were really done with our job. I was to leave on the Toll. My companions at McMurdo were to leave on the Curtis and they made a port call back in Australia. I missed out on that. And the reason I left early was that the Navy wanted me back in Rhode Island at Davisville to facilitate the ordering of survival equipment and clothing for the following year's expedition, because we had learned the hard way that what the Navy had provided for the first years of the operation was totally inadequate for the conditions that existed. Memories of an extraordinary part of my life. Farewell party, 3 penguins on an ice floe. Wow. Want to do it again?
You want to do it again?
I don't think I've ever done it 2 times exactly the same. But I like the spontaneity of it.
Doesn't seem like you need a script.
Yeah. Well, having lived it, it makes a difference, you know. These are 2 volumes of the journal that I kept during that period, starting, as it says here, 30 October 1955. And the second volume starts in 11 June of 56. I've drawn a little sketch of Observation Hill on it with the cross to Captain Scott and his party on the top. It's a chronicle of life at McMurdo, everyday life, life aboard ship going to Antarctica. And so I found it useful. My regret is that I wasn't religious in keeping it up to date. There are periods of several weeks, in 1 or 2 cases, even a month or so, where there's no documentation of what was going on. This is written aboard the Private John Toll after we had left McMurdo. Life aboard ship is tedious. There is nothing to do, and the time passes slowly. I am thankful that I am flying for New Zealand, as I think that the cruise home on the Curtis will be long and boring. This ship doesn't roll much, but as we sleep in the after gun crew's quarters, we go up and down a lot. Quarters are cramped, but I don't care as long as we are northbound. Rereading the thoughts is it brings back memories, of course, and what happens is these are memories that have lain dormant for many decades, and so things you've long since forgotten and suddenly come alive. So that is the purpose of the journal, of course. I felt almost obligated to share my experience with as many people as I could, and over the years I have shown the video to probably well over 10,000 people, maybe 20,000. I've lost track. It sounds like a lot, but when you divide it by the number of years since 1957, it's not that many each year. But it is almost an obsession with me to share this for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's extremely important for people to understand what the Antarctic is, where it is, and how it fits into the planet's jigsaw puzzle. The South Pole is still one of the key science stations on our planet. It has been expanded greatly. It has been replaced 4 times since 1956, 57, when it was built. It has been manned, or I should say now manned and womaned, continuously since that time. And there's been some amazing science that has come out of the South Pole over the years. The pole itself is moving, and it moves a little bit every year because the ice on which it is located is moving inexorably towards the ocean. So that is part of feature of the polar plateau, the great ice shield at the top of the Antarctic continent. It's continuously moving to the oceans and breaking off, and that has got the scientists today very interested, because this ultimately, if it accelerates, is going to contribute to global sea rise. The source of the shelf ice is here, and what happens is this annual snowfall, although it's hardly, almost not measurable, over the millions of years it has accumulated. So you have 6,000 plus feet of snow here, and the pressure of that, the weight of that ice and snow, it's like having a mound of dough on the top of a table. And you come along and you put a big platter on top of the dough and push down, and it squeezes out at the edges. So it's squeezing out at the edges here, and that's the source of the ice in the ice shelf. And so here we have the Transantarctic Range with a whole lot of glaciers, glacial valleys feeding it. So the elevation up here is 9,000 to 11,000 feet, and then it forces the ice down these rivers called glaciers onto the Great Ross Ice Shelf, and the Great Ross Ice Shelf is continually moving, not very fast, but it doesn't matter if it's a few feet a year or a quarter mile a year, but it's continually moving north. And so ultimately it gets to the edge and it will break off. So that's the reason science is so important, is to see if we can figure out what's happening and why it's happening. Well, there's no question about why it's happening. We have climate change, and the Earth is warming up at an unprecedented rate. Much of the evidence for that warm-up actually has been taken from the Antarctic in ice cores that go back as much as 1 million years, because we can analyze those ice cores that we bring up from the interface between the rock underneath the ice and the ice itself, and it's like looking at tree rings on a stump that has been recently cut. There are bands of not annual necessarily, but 100-year bands or 200 or even 500-year bands, and we can see how much the precipitation was. We can also, using very highly developed scientific techniques, determine the temperature at the time that ice was laid down, and that's very critical. So we can actually see temperature patterns going back almost 1 million years now. The dogs, each one had its own personality. There's no question that they had personalities, and anybody who argues that has never worked with a team of dogs. We had 30 dogs altogether, 2 teams of 11, and then some spares. My favorite dog was Sitka, because he was the most companionable of the lot. And, you know, as you would imagine, there were times during the winter when you felt a little bit blue, a little lonely. You wanted to go home to mommy. And so I would go down to the kennel and sit on Sitka's kennel, and he would jump up and sit beside me and put his head on my shoulder and say basically to me, "Dave, you know, share your troubles with me." And occasionally I'd get a lick on the cheek. "Hey, here's a treat, come on." "Oh, yes, yes, hello, yes, how's my boy?" Well, dogs have always been a part of my life. Since I got my first dog was Marco. He was a mixed chow breed, and I think I was 5, 6 years old when we got him. I had a couple others after Marco, but the next dogs I had were in Antarctica, all 30 of them. And they were my favorites among them. But when I returned from Antarctica, I had this idea of maybe I would get some sled dogs. But they really are not good dogs to be in the tropical areas, and I was having duty stations in Hawaii. So I ended up getting golden retrievers, and we've had golden retrievers almost continuously since then. It's really hard to lose them, and we've had to do that a number of times. We've had them cremated, and we've taken them places where they love to hike. So they're a great comfort. They're great companions, and I really can't imagine living without them. Another trip we took was to Cape Evans, the site of Captain Scott's cabin that he built and left for the South Pole in his second expedition. Cape Evans was about 13 or 14 miles north of our camp at McMurdo at Ross Island, or at Hut Point. And it was an easy trip up across the sea ice, and we pitched tent that night, and it was our intent to spend a night and then return back to Hut Point the next day. That night we were struck by a storm that lasted 3 days, and it was so fearsome that at one point we decided that we might better find alternative shelter. About midnight we were awakened by a terrible noise. The tent walls were flapping and the howling of the wind outside was so loud that even in the confines of our small tent, conversation was impossible. There was little we could do. We had tied the windward guy line to an anchor chain frozen in the ice, left over from the Scott days. However, the sides of the tent are flapping so wildly that I fear that they will rip apart and leave us exposed to the elements. With a temperature below -20 and the wind blowing at least 60 knots, we will not last very long, even inside our down sleeping bags. Last night I prayed more in 8 hours than I have in the last 8 years. St. Christopher and I became close friends. With the coming of morning, the skies have lightened, but the wind continues to blow. Travel for more than a few yards is impossible. The dogs have done what all sled dogs do under these conditions and slept it out. The snow drifted over them. The only sign that they are still with us are 11 small mounds of snow, evenly spaced along the snow-buried tethering line. The sleds are buried under drifting snow. We spent over an hour tightening the lines on the tent and doubling up on the ice pitons that anchor the tent to the ice. Our situation is not good. We must find an alternative shelter in case the tent is destroyed by the wind. Later in the day I wrote, Jack remembered a photograph in a book about Scott's expedition that showed a small window located just below the eaves on the leeward side of the cabin. The three of us scrambled up the wind-packed snowdrift that extends from the corner of the building onto the roof of the pony shed that adjoins the cabin. We dug away the snow between the roof and the shed and eaves of the cabin, and in a few minutes discovered the window, held in place by 2 bent nails that looked as if they'd been placed there a few days ago, not 40 years ago. In less than a minute, using the tip of an ice axe, we pried the window out and looked through the small pane. The room below looked as if the occupants had just left and would return any minute. A frozen liquid, I think it's cocoa, fills several cups. A plate of large biscuits is on the table, as well as a teapot nestled on a Primus stove. The wall to the left is covered with shelves on which books, bottles, and packages of food are stored. The wall to the right has hooks and nails on which hung sweaters, parkas, and some harnesses for the dogs. Almost everything is covered with frost. It is an extraordinary sight. A lot of water has gone over the dam since 1957, and I've traveled a lot more of the world, seen a lot more of the world. I've been fortunate in having returned to New Zealand, to South America, to the Arctic, to Eastern and Western Europe, and there are lots of places that I would love to go back to because I really have found them to be wonderful places with wonderful people to see and visit. But Antarctica stands out as really an extraordinary exception to that, because I was young, I was naive, I was curious. Not that I'm not still curious, but I learned a lot about myself. Not only while I was there, but in retrospect and looking back at my time there and applying a lot of the lessons learned to my life. So the question I often am asked, if you had a chance to do it over again, to make a different decision, would I have chosen not to go? And the answer is an unqualified no, I would always have gone. Going to different places on the planet, and not just places in isolation like the Arctic or the Antarctic, but there are places here in North America that are off the beaten track, different, where the people are different, where the scenery is different, where the conditions are different. And I would just say, take a chance, try it out. You may find something that is compelling to you, some place you'll want to go back to again and again, or a place that will teach you some valuable lessons about yourself.
And then, if you could go back to Antarctica tomorrow, would you go?
In a heartbeat. In a heartbeat.
July 1st marks the beginning of one of the great scientific adventures of our time, the International Geophysical Year. During this period, which will actually be 18 months long, the scientists of the United States will join their efforts with those of the scientists of some 60 other nations to make the most intensive study ever undertaken of our planet. The scientists tell us that they cannot possibly anticipate all of the valuable scientific knowledge that will result from their efforts. They believe that many of the facts thus acquired will give us new understanding and new power over the forces of nature. As I see it, however, the most important result of the International Geophysical Year is the demonstration of the ability of peoples of all nations to work together harmoniously for the common good. I hope this can become common practice in other fields of human endeavor.